Welcome to the Parent Teacher Conference podcast, conversations on raising adolescents and teens. I'm your host, Braden Bell, and I am truly delighted to be here with you today, especially with a truly phenomenal and exciting guest. Before I introduce her, I want to ask a quick favor. Can you please take a moment and give us a rating at Apple Podcasts or wherever else you access your podcasts? It helps a great deal to get the word out. My guest today is Amy Joyce. Amy is the editor of the On Parenting section of the Washington Post. A graduate of Catholic University, she's worked at the Post now for 27 years and lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, journalist Stephen Ginsburg. She's the mother of two sons, 16 and 13. Amy is a truly wonderful person. She's one of those people who is able to balance humanity and professionalism, skill and empathy. She is able to be clear, but also humane and kind. It's a remarkable balancing act, I think, to carry out these virtues as well as she does. Amy is the consummate professional, but is also very warm and approachable. I worked with Amy through email long before I ever met her. So I knew who she was and a little bit about her, but I was still quite nervous to meet her, actually. We were asked to be on a panel together, speaking to people who were hoping to maybe break into publishing, specifically with parenting pieces of the Washington Post. But I really knew who the main draw was. After all, if I had made it and Amy hadn't, people would have responded a little bit differently than if Amy made it and I hadn't. So I met Amy at our appointed time and we talked through our plan. She was gracious and professional as always. She was meeting with a lot of aspiring authors, which is not always the easiest dynamic to strike for an editor, but she handled it beautifully. Anyway, our presentation went well, and then Amy went her way and I went mine. Before I left, we talked for a moment. I just told her how excited and anxious I was to get home to Nashville and see my family and my wife especially. I got home, I believe, on a Sunday morning, and that night there were terrible tornadoes in Nashville. They caused enormous devastation and loss of life even. One of the first people I heard from that morning was Amy, just checking in to make sure I was okay. And that's who Amy is, a consummate professional, but also one with a great deal of empathy. Now, I asked Amy to be here on this podcast because I wanted to hear what she's learned from her job. All of us have access to so much parenting information, which can be really wonderful, but it can also be a little difficult. Amy spends her day reading through pieces, editing pieces, getting ready to publish pieces, thinking about important topics, hearing from important people with important things to say. And then she goes home and is a parent. And so I've asked her to share with us some of what she's learned about how to balance this huge amount of information with really parenting in the moment and any other things she's learned. So I'm so excited today to welcome Amy Joyce to the podcast. Amy, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You're making me tear up here. So
Wow.
it's so kind, such a kind intro, but it's so good to see you and to talk to you. It's been too long.
It has been a long time. We were just reminiscing kind of right before we started that when we saw each other, this conference was it was like in February of, I don't even remember, 2020, I guess, or at any rate, we were starting to hear about this strange new illness that was spreading across the world and wondered what was ahead of us. So yeah, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then.
Yeah, I think that might have been like the last big thing we probably both did. Definitely the last big event I did before the world shut down.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Well, so tell us a little bit about yourself, will you, and how you came to do what you do.
Well, as you mentioned, I've been at the Post for a very long time. I didn't mean for that to happen. I didn't expect that to happen, but what a great place to end up. But I started out there as a copy aide my last year of college, and then, moved into a news aide position, started writing for the business section, met my now husband there when we were both copy aides, very young. And I just knew growing up that I wanted to work with words and write. And, I just love the idea of sort of holding truth to power and just, trying to do right in the world. So that was my main impetus for going in this line of work. And I started out, I was very young and was asked to write a career column for Gen Xers back when Gen Xers were, you know, 20 somethings. So that was sort of my first big role at the Post. And then I was a business reporter, labor reporter, and then I became pregnant with my son, my first son. And I thought I didn't want to have these daily news deadlines anymore. And I applied to be an editor in the weekend section, which is a local section at the Post, with movie reviews and going out things. And it was just, and I got hired the day I got home from the hospital with him. They called and said I got the job. So it was sort of amazingly perfect timing. So when I came back to work after my maternity leave, that's what I was doing, feature editing and just, you know, fun things going on in DC. And then a few years into that, and I was pregnant with my second son, and um, there was a woman running a parenting blog at the Post that we had launched, but it was just sort of a shell. She didn't really know what to do with it, and we were joking because she didn't have kids. It was just part of her job. And I said, so I have two kids and I don't have time to go out anymore. And I'm editing stories about going out and clubbing and going to bars. And you don't have any kids and you're running the parenting section. And so we said, let's see if they'll let us switch. So we literally went to somebody, my friend and editor, Liz Seymour, and said, what do you think of Camille and me switching? And she went for it. And it was great. Camille ended up doing a great job in the weekend section. And then I just loved being able to have this blank slate and do whatever I wanted with parenting with two young kids at home. So that's how that all started. And it started, gosh, I should have looked this up, but it's been at least 12 years, I think, that we've been doing this. And so it started out primarily, as you know, personal essays, a lot of personal essays that just I find so fulfilling and interesting, and that's personally what I love to read. But then it has morphed over the years into different lines of coverage, and we're doing a lot more newsy, you know, news you can use, advice pieces now that I find very, very helpful for myself, and I hope my readers do too. So that's sort of the background there.
It seems like you've gone to a lot more like deeply reported
Yes,
pieces. And
yeah.
and then
So
you also have a wonderful parenting coach who comes on, is it twice a week?
So Megan Leahy, and she writes a weekly column for us and then does an online chat every other
Yeah,
week.
every other week. That's right.
Yeah.
So it's great stuff. I mean, you also, Amy, and I don't know, I'm not sure there's records of this, but my sense is a lot of the people who I'm hearing about now who are writing books that are really getting a lot of attention, it seems like I read them first, like when they wrote an essay 6 years ago or 5 years ago, and on parenting. So you've
Yeah.
I think have actually kind of helped launch several people, or at least help them on their way. Some really important parenting thinkers.
Yes. That's nice of you to say, but it is kind of true that a lot of, not a lot, but a good handful of people who've started writing for on parenting do have books now. And yeah, I actually have them all up on my shelves. And you know, I'm just so proud to see that. I People a lot of times say, okay, so you started out writing, but now you're editing, it's like you're hiding as an editor, but and you don't get the recognition because your name isn't on things. But I have been a little surprised by how much joy and pride I have when I see that stuff out there. It's just so amazing to me. And you know, just yeah, you all have done so well. You've written for me too. Um, but it's just, I just think there are so many amazing voices out there with so many amazing thoughts. And so it's just, yeah, the more the merrier. It's hard to say no, because there's so many good things to be published out there. But
Yeah. You just expressed an emotion that I think probably most parents can relate to. The idea of it's not maybe always going to be me in the spotlight, but I'm so proud to see what has come of my efforts. So that's a wonderful attitude for an editor to have, but I suspect a lot of us can empathize with that idea as well.
yeah, that's a really good connection. You're absolutely right.
So the other thing I would say is you actually do write, or rather maybe not a lot every week, but because I like you introduce maybe is it twice a week, you write like an introduction for the newsletter that
Yeah.
has all of the pieces. And so I think you actually do have a fair, at least I feel like I've actually been able to read a lot of your insights over the years. I honestly always read, I wait for the newsletter because I want to read what you say about all the pieces,
Oh,
before I actually read the pieces. So I
nice.
think yeah, you do make your mark for sure.
Well, thanks. Yeah, the newsletters are fun. Sort of scratches my itch when I want to write. And then, sometimes I'll write an intro to the newsletter and think, gosh, I could go deeper on this, and I will write a piece based on something there. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a great job.
So listeners, if you're not sure what we're talking about, I think I should be clear from context clues, but the Washington Post has a wonderful section called On Parenting, which you can access. Honestly, I buy my subscription to the Post for that reason alone, just so I have access to On Parenting. It's really wonderful. It's a great resource, but you can have it delivered to your inbox, which is super convenient. So let's talk about these pieces, all these wonderful pieces you've read and published over the years, that you've written about. Tell me, I guess first of all, from the time you started, so like 12 years ago to now, you must have seen some just colossal tectonic shifts in what parents are worried about, thinking about, what you're hearing, what people are saying. And I'd love to hear you'd kind of just, I don't know, track through that. What have you noticed?
Gosh. Okay. So, I guess the biggest change, and this as a teacher and a parent, is technology. Um, and our struggles with how much screen time our kids have, what age they should have phones, how to be careful with how they use phones, and yet let them learn from their mistakes, because this is our world. It's not like we're putting that genie back in the bottle. And they do make mistakes.
Yeah.
And parents make mistakes, and I make mistakes, and my husband makes mistakes. So that has been, I think, the biggest change from when I started till now, is just how much focus parents have to have on modern technology and social media, and just how our kids connect with the world. Um, that's been huge. Um, Definitely see many more fathers being much more active, um, than, you know, even
Sure.
15 years ago, I'd say.
Right. Yeah.
And that's delightful. And the dads these days, I think, are surprised when people are surprised that they're as involved as they are. And so I find that really interesting, and I like to shed some light on that. So those are definitely some changes. And then a big theme, and you hit on this a little bit, is the whole idea of teaching empathy and kindness. And that's been shifting a lot over recent years as well. It's been a line of coverage I've loved from the very beginning, and has actually been very successful for us. So I know a lot of people want to read about it as well. How do you raise a kind kid, and how do you teach empathy? But I'm finding in recent years, and the way this world has gone with politics and whatnot, that it is very interesting and difficult and important, um, to really get into that with your kids.
Yeah.
And people really are curious how to sort of get kids on track.
Yeah. Well, so Amy, I'm curious, there is so much information all of us have, but I don't know how many pieces of parenting advice do you see a day?
Oh gosh, I have no idea. I
I mean,
honestly, the emails I get, at least 100 a day, I would say. The pieces I read each day, many. I don't even know how to
you
sum it up.
probably see what, like, say 500 a week. Is that
Probably,
like
yeah,
crazy?
it's crazy. I haven't counted. But it's a lot. And so, yeah, I tell people all the time, if you don't hear back from me, follow up, because things do fall through the cracks. But yeah, you see a lot of pieces each week, in coming at me, in email and in other ways. But
Yeah.
There's a lot of information out there.
There, how do you deal with that? How does that not just make your head explode when you go home and you need to parent? Like, I'm
Right.
truly curious how you manage this because it sounds like a huge balance to me.
It is, and sometimes my head does explode. And, and my kids tease me about it, but it started out not as a joke. It was, my older son was starting middle school, and all of his friends got smartphones, and my husband and I gave him a flip phone. And he handled it well, being a middle schooler. And, we live in the city, he rides a bus, like, we knew he needed some form of communication connection with us, but, he handled it well. But a few months in, he said, "Sometimes I really wish you didn't know as much about parenting as you do." And, that kid is now 16 and, has his smartphone, but, it's true. It's I know too much, and, I still make a ton of mistakes, and I still look back on my own parenting and be like, "Gosh, I wish I had, approached it this way." I'm reading a story from someone, like, "That's a really smart way. I wish I had done that with Sam, or I wish I had done that with Jonah." So, it is hard to turn it off, and it's hard to, not judge myself a lot, based on the things I read. But you know, when people say, "Oh, so you write about parenting, or you edit parenting, and you have kids," it's true. Like, I think about parenting 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
It's a lot. Yeah.
So I want to just maybe underscore something that really hit me and resonated with me. And listeners, I would imagine all of you can relate to this too. But you may be one of the, I don't know, most informed people in the United States about parenting, and yet you still mentioned that there's things you look back on and wish you would have done differently, or there's
Hmm.
times you wish you would have responded differently. And so I just want to pause on that because that, it seems to me, maybe one of the most universal feelings of parents. And I guess the point I want to draw from that is that no matter how much information you have or how little information you have, all of us make mistakes. No matter how much you think about this, no matter how much you, in my case, write about it or read about it or whatever, there's still going to be times you're not going to execute your parenting in the way you might have hoped, and especially in retrospect. So this is a time I feel like, or a way that we should all show each other a lot more grace than I think we do.
Hmm.
Because this feeling of doing it wrong, I think, is one of the most common things that we face as parents.
Right. Right. And, Megan Leahy, our parenting advice columnist, says this all the time, but she said, "We're all just figuring this out as we're going along." It's not like I mean, even if you do have many kids, each kid is different. Um, and the way you handle each child has to be different, and each teenager has to be different based on who they are and who they're becoming. And you can't make them
Right.
be a certain person. And that is probably my biggest takeaway from all these years of parenting, is they are who they are. Like, you can do your best and guide them, and, you know, make your own boundaries and give them their rules, but they are who they are. And hopefully they will grow up to be good people, if you're doing it right. And, you know, um, it's hard, but parents are very hard on themselves, and parents are very hard on other parents.
They
the
are.
the
They are.
comments on our stories, and, the judging that goes on. And so, that's very hard to take as a parent, when you're judging yourself too,
Right.
or thinking that you're making mistakes along the way, and you are, and you should be, because we're not perfect, and neither are our kids. And, you're doing the best you can. And that's sort of what I live by too. And I try to remind myself when I'm up, thinking about how I should have done something differently, or how I wish I could go back in time just for that one day, or,
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Do you have a little, I don't know, do you have like a mental flow chart or um, protocol where you're able to somehow say, sort through something and say, yes, I'm going to take this home with me. No, I'm not. Or do you just have to kind of intuitively work through it all the time?
You mean with, when I'm reading something? Yeah.
Yeah, with all the
Uh,
information you're exposed to.
So I would say it's both. There are some things where, I'll read about this amazing chart you can use to help your kids understand how much time they're wasting on their phones. And so, very specific things I will do. But, for instance, that chart, I've been talking about doing that with my kids and my husband for a couple of weeks now, and we still haven't done it. So I do bring it home and don't always live by it. Um,
Which is, I think, very, very standard parenting.
yeah, yeah, it's a great idea that I haven't done. But a lot of it's intuitive. I would hope that a lot of the good stuff that has come through on parenting has just sort of become the way I parent. And also, I'm lucky enough to have a partner in this, and I will send him pieces and be like, you have to read this because this really pertains to us right now. And he'll take things away from that as well. But I'm not real conscious about it. I don't come home and say, oh, I read this today and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, but it definitely makes its way into our everyday lives and into the way I think about how I parent
Yeah.
my own kids.
That's great. So all of us who are out there just with so much information, um, I love that idea of maybe just this is kind of an artistic process too. Is you just take the information in, and then maybe just let us kind of let it percolate or whatever, and then the good stuff maybe will come out as you're just living your life and as you're parenting, and then also some of the really sometimes there's something really specific or helpful, like you mentioned that the chart to
Right.
indicate wasted cell phone time. I fear very much that at least one of my children doesn't need the chart because um it would be just if it's like a pie chart, it'd just be all one color. It'd be like entire 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 life wasted with cell phone use. But
Right.
I can see that'd be a good starting point at least.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. When they're complaining, like, I don't have any time. I don't have enough time for X, Y, and Z. And it's like, okay, well, let's look at how much time. It makes a lot of sense, but yeah, it's not always
yeah,
easy to sit down and
right.
do.
Well, and that's the other thing is even the most informed, careful, thoughtful parent in the world is working with another human being, and immature, unfully formed human being at that. And
Right.
so they, like you said, I mean, they get a vote in our parenting as well. And it's not like they're blank slates. We have to give them their space as well. So it's an
Right.
intricate dance.
Right.
What are some of the I'm curious if there's any particular advice you have heard personally over the years, read or heard, that just has really stuck with you? Are there particular pieces that you remember that just made maybe a deep impact?
Um, One that I ran very early on in this was by a Harvard psychologist in the department of in their education department. And he started a group there. His name's Rick Weisbord. He's quoted a lot. Um, but he did a piece for me early on based on research, and it was 5 ways to raise kind kids. And that piece still, we can follow what pieces get read. It's been, I don't
Really?
even remember when it ran. I think like 20, I don't, a long time ago. I should look that up right now. But that stuck with me and had a big impact on me. And it's always been something that I've cared a lot about. But he broke it down in such an interesting way, and it's based on research. So that was one that just sort of stayed with me for a long time. Um, I have a writer who writes for me, Phyllis Fagel. She's a
Yes.
school counselor, and she does a lot of great work, great advice, um, of many different ways, but she focuses on middle schoolers. So that was really
Mhm.
interesting to me as my boys have gone through middle school, and they really are like more than any other time that I found really becoming who they are at that point. And
Yeah.
people, say, "Oh my God, middle school, it's the worst." But she has taught me how to actually embrace it and find the joy and like help them be who they are through middle school. So that's always been pretty delightful and helpful. And let's see, just did a piece with Jenny Wallace, just did a book, and I did a piece with her, and it's about pressure and the pressure that we
Yes.
put on our kids. And I'm gonna look up the book name right now and make sure I get it right. But her book is Never Enough, when achievement culture becomes toxic and what we can do about it. And I have found over the years just like the pressure we put on our kids and the pressure they're already feeling about getting into college and getting into the right college and taking the right extracurriculars and um as I was talking to her, it just reminded me, especially now that I have a kid who's a junior in high school, like when he comes home, that I want this to be the place where he feels safe and comfortable and like he can breathe a little. So that was a little eye-opening for me. I'm not nagging him as much since I talked to her and did that piece with her. So those stand out. You've done some amazing pieces for me that I'd love to mention because I love your view on the world as a dad and I think a grandfather, right?
Yes.
Yes, and a teacher. You see so much and have learned so much as a teacher. So you've done some pieces for me that I hope you'll link to and notes. But you did 7 things to understand your about your teen, I believe. Do you remember that
Yeah,
one?
I do actually.
Yeah, and that was very helpful for me. I think that was before my kid was officially a teen that we ran that, but that was in 2020. I'm looking now.
Yeah, it's been a little while.
Yeah. So
You're
I
very
don't
kind to
know.
mention that, by the way. Thank you.
Well, no, you've done some great pieces for us. And I do feel like one of the main benefits of this job is if I'm curious about something, I can get somebody to research and write it, or I can do it myself.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about being a reporter and a writer. And usually, if I'm curious about something, it means other people are too. So, yeah, I
Yeah,
feel like I have my own little guides here.
you do really have a good, I mean, you have a wonderful, I'm glad they let you switch. I'm sure you were great at covering restaurants and clubbing and stuff. I have no
It's a
doubt,
lot
but
of fun.
this has been wonderful because you, as a parent yourself, and I don't mean to say that someone who is not a parent couldn't do this, but you just have a very visceral sense of what is a parent worried about right now, right at this moment in this particular time, at this particular age. And I think that's one thing you bring that is such a gift to your work, a gift to everyone else, is that you're not just looking at things kind of, I don't know, academically or theoretically. You're thinking, my gosh, how do I get my kid to not feel pressure um, because college is coming, or how in the world am I going to manage this situation with this cell phone? And so it's sort of like every parent out there, I guess, in a way. And then you get asked questions and get them answered. So again, I just think you do an incredible service for people.
Well, thanks. Yeah, lucky me that I get to do this. It's pretty great. So, yeah.
And listeners, I will put all of those pieces in the show notes. One of the people that Amy mentioned is Phyllis Fagel, who has just come out with a new book, and it is very much worth your time. I'm actually hoping to have her on before too much longer. She's in the throes of a book tour and things, but this book is called Middle School Superpowers, and I'll talk more about it later. But it basically asks a question that says, "What if middle school is the origin story of the superhero that your child is going to become?" And she frames common things that we might think are terrible about middle school. For example, social challenges and lack of confidence or conflicts with peers. And she talks about how those actually can launch them into the superhero that they're meant to be. It's a really wonderful book. And again, we'll be talking more about it. But since Amy mentioned Phyllis, I wanted to just to shout her book out. It's quite worth your time. Um,
Okay.
what is it? Is there a parenting trend you thought was coming on big and you're kind of glad maybe it ended, that you saw coming, and now you
Um,
look back and you're like, wow, that was crazy.
um, Goodness, let me think. You mean things that parents did?
Yeah, or was there, like, I don't know, some kind of weird, it seems like there's a lot of really timeless advice that you get, but it
Right.
also seems like parenting has its trends just like anything else, kind of its fads.
Yeah. There was so much talk about helicopter parenting and so much that we did about helicopter parenting and it's still happening. So the trend hasn't ended, but that's another one. Jess Leahy, her book and
Yeah.
pieces that she did for us about the gift of failure, like the importance of letting your kid make mistakes and forget things. And, they left their homework on the dining room table and they're a junior in high school, so, or maybe she more middle schooler so they can learn and not fail. But yeah, the helicopter parenting, the whole thing with parents, helping their kids lie to get into colleges. I feel like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's maybe not happening as much, and I think was a wake-up call for a lot of parents, like, "Oh my god, what are we doing?"
Yeah.
So that's yeah, um,
Well, and that piece you wrote on pressure kind of ties into that too.
right.
Um, so listeners, actually the cover of the book, if I'm not mistaken, it's really brilliant, but it basically shows a pencil where the lead has snapped off because someone is just shoving the pencil down so hard. And then it talks, I forget all the subtitle again, you mentioned a minute ago, but it's just basically talking about the crushing amount of pressure that we're putting on our kids. Do you want to talk a little bit about that piece you wrote with her, by the way?
Sure. So, Jenny writes for us from time to time, does great work, and she's really clued in. And her book in part came about because of a piece that she did for us about where there was this. Gosh, I'm gonna get this not quite right, but let me look it up real quick. So she said to me, "Oh my gosh, I just saw that." Students in high achieving schools are being named an at-risk group on the same level as kids in foster care and extreme poverty. And she doesn't conflate the two, like obviously, you know, but for different reasons they were named an at-risk group. And rates of suicide were going up, rates of depression and anxiety were going way up in these kids who are at these like high achieving schools. And so from that, she started researching it, and that was
Wow.
the book came about. So when we talked, it was a lot about sort of what we are doing to our kids, even if they're not in high achieving schools. A lot of us, myself included, I will find myself nagging or making sure that they're doing the right activities, or making sure, that you think you're done with that homework, go back and do it again. When you know like she said, it should be like home is the safe place, and you can have real conversations, and they can learn from you, as opposed to just like doing homework and doing essays. And so that was really interesting to me, just the conversation with her and her book, which is fascinating. And I think really does apply to teenagers who aren't just in high achieving schools, and parents whose kids aren't just going to Ivy League schools. Yeah, we put a lot of pressure on our kids.
Yeah.
So that was actually really helpful to me as a parent. And I'm really glad that that information's out there for other people to read.
I'm gonna, if I may, just interject with a really sad story about that situation. There was a student I was worked with very closely and stayed in touch with after the student graduated. And later on in the student's high school career, had time to just sit down and chat. We were in a situation that just allowed us to talk for a while. And I get a little emotional. I go between being really choked up and being like rage filled. But so the student was telling me that she wasn't very good academically. And I'm like, well, I don't, you were always a good student. What do you mean? And it was brilliantly talented in some other ways. And I just said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, I had the lowest average of everyone in my year. And I'm like, what?
Oh, my
First of all, how do you know that? Why did anyone let you know that? But I was like, my gosh, what's your average? Because it did start to sound a little um, grim. Well, it's just bees. And I thought, oh my gosh, like what are we doing to these kids? This
right.
is a bright, talented, fun, creative, like this is a great kid, all around great kid. And anyway, bees really aren't um bad grades. I mean, at least they didn't used to be bad grades. So anyway, I have not had a chance to read this book, but I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah. Yeah, we do this as parents, from the start. You start comparing your kid to other kids. You don't maybe realize you're doing it. I definitely did. Remember first grade, and Sam would be fine with me saying this, but I was like, he seems like he's not reading at the same level as the other. My friends would be telling me about these books their kids were reading, and they were 5, 6 years old. And I thought, oh my God, what are we doing wrong? And um, instead of stepping back and taking deep breath and looking at who my kid was, I pressured him a lot, and I think forced him to do homework when he just couldn't sit still and do the homework. And that's one of my regrets. I look back on it, and it ends up, Sam's it got dyslexia and has attention issues that he just very smartly for years worked around, and we didn't catch until later. And instead of I don't know. I think I would look at it and use it to compare and worry about and put more pressure on him as opposed to treating it in a different way. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it's hard. You start comparing your kids and you start thinking about their future, and I think it's a thing that a lot of parents do, and it's hard to step back and not jump on that ride.
I think actually this just occurred to me, Amy, but when we talk about, all this information out there, if there was, if a parent has time to maybe do one source of information, I wonder if it might be wise to try to understand what happens normally at each developmentally, what happens at certain ages. And so you're able to compare with a large swath of ranges and people, as opposed to just looking around at the kids in your class, for example, because I imagine he was not all that unusual by if you had a larger sample, but in the
Right.
right, and it's easy to panic. Um, Mary Lara Philpott was on just last time, and this is a little lighter hearted, but she was in a she talked about being in a conference where the kindergarten teacher said, "Well, your child's not very good with scissors yet." And she's like, "At what point was I supposed to give him sharp things? And how did every other parent know that whatever this was the moment to suddenly give your child sharp things so they'd be ready to cut for kindergarten?" Um,
Right.
and yours is a little more poignant and hers is funny, but I do think it reveals this tension of modern parenting where we're in almost just inherently comparative and
Yeah.
with each other, but also I think schools maybe make that worse, unfortunately, as well.
For sure. And one funny, not funny story about Sam, I used to, be one of the parents driving the little league carpool. And I remember driving, they must have been in third or fourth grade. And there's like 6 little boys in my car, and they were all comparing their reading scores, their, what is
Oh
that
my
called? Their
gosh.
Lexile scores. They just did
Yeah.
their,
Oh my
um,
goodness.
and they all knew their numbers. And Sam and this other little boy who also now is dyslexic, we're like, wow, what's wrong with us? And they would
Oh
joke
my
about their scores,
gosh.
but I was just like, they're comparing themselves. And that was really a wake up call for me too. Like, I don't, we shouldn't be letting this happen. And, yeah. And it's interesting. And, Sam was it was probably around that age where he said to me, I was making him do his, read his book. And he said, "Isn't it so annoying, Mom, when you're reading a line and you can't keep your eyes on the same line and it's just bound?" And I'm like, oh,
Oh,
there's the light bulb. He's like, "Isn't that weird how that
oh,
happens?"
Amy.
I'm like, oh. So just these little wake up calls over the years. I'm like, right, okay. So I'm, focus on this kid, not on the group, not on who's
Yeah,
around him, and he does
right.
great in school. He's fine, and you know, doesn't love reading and probably never will. And that's like my first love. So that's just another example of us, kids are who they are.
Yeah.
Like you can't force it.
I think you actually wrote about this at some point. Like, as a, I'm just
Mhm.
all of a sudden now I'm remembering because
I
you
did.
talked about what a love of it was for you reading and how it would never be his. It was really a poignant. I think it was an introduction, one of the introductions you did in the newsletter, if I'm not
Maybe.
mistaken.
Yeah,
But at
I
any
did do
rate, it
an
was
essay with his permission, and he read
yeah,
it first. I did do an
yes, that's
essay
right.
about that because it was like one of the things that we really do enjoy doing. He's 16. I still read out loud to mostly Sam. His brother likes to read on his own, but we'll read a book together, and I read it out loud, and he just, it's just sort of our connection. And then he's reading his books, and yeah.
That is so lovely. What a neat thing. That's also a great I don't know. Sometimes I think about uh, parenting jujitsu, where you use the momentum of your adversary and you flip it, kind of, I think is what jujitsu is all about. I may be
Oh,
completely
yeah.
wrong, but at any rate, this idea that you have a situation like there that could have been difficult, but you flipped it, and now you have this wonderful bond where you read to him. But that only happened because you were able to recognize where he was and what he truly was and what he could do, and then you
Yeah.
were able to, once you sort of knew that and embraced it, you're able to have this wonderful thing together, which I think is really lovely.
Thanks. Yeah. And then that right there is like parenting, right? You can't
Yeah.
snap your fingers and it's all fixed. You
Right.
just sort of you keep trying and you know, sometimes things work out.
I'm more and more convinced that um, well, I noticed something a couple of years ago. We would have these really incredible speakers come to school. I mean, sometimes they were local, but sometimes they were like nationally renowned, including Jessica Leahy, for example, and
Yeah.
some others, just Robert Evans, just incredible people. And it was always a little disappointing, but it was always a fairly small group, and it was always the same ones. And it was inevitably people whose kids already seemed to really have it together. Not perfect, but like, it occurred to me, like, why is it that the really good parents are the only ones that come to these ever? And it finally occurred to me that I think that they're really good parents not because they come to those. I think they're good parents because they're engaged and they're thoughtful and they're
Mhm.
always trying to learn. And that's why they come to those seminars, basically. And that led me to just kind of my big belief that parenting is less about executing a particular set of actions or words at specifically the right time, and more about just ongoing engagement, just trying, failing, learning, but the engagement is really what it's about.
Right. And being curious. And that's what we want our kids to be too,
Yeah.
right? Be
Yes.
engaged, be curious.
Yeah, curious. And then also that, you want a lot of empathy, I think, too, in that experience for your son.
Right.
I'm sure the way you handle it. Has there ever been, Amy, a piece that you published that just, I don't know, really surprised you? The reception or response just really surprised you in a, I mean, positive or negative, just, but it
Right.
maybe took off in a way you hadn't expected it to.
Yes, but I can't think of one. Honestly, I mentioned it already. Yeah, I'm like, oh geez, what was that? The
Oh,
kindness,
the kindness
how to
piece.
raise
Yeah.
kind kids. That one
Yeah.
is my big shock. And Rick, who wrote it, still talks about it. He was like, it was like lightning in a bottle, but it was. It just the fact that it just keeps coming back, and I find it very heartening because it shows you that parents want to have kind kids, once
Yes.
they want to help raise kind kids. So that's sort of the one that will always stand out to me is like the
That's wonderful.
surprise, you know. Yeah.
And I'm glad it was that one. I'm glad it wasn't like how to make sure your child shows no weakness ever to anyone,
Right.
or something
Oh,
like
well,
that. Yeah.
yeah, there was anytime we write about spanking and how spanking's not okay, that always does really well. And then there are always people who say, well, I was spanked and
Right.
you know, and I turned out okay. And, yeah, so those always do well.
You know what? You bring up that's a really interesting point. I wonder if we could explore for a minute the idea. I see this in school a lot too. Well, you know, I went to school and we did it this way, and I think I'm fine. Or, whether that's academics or discipline or whatever. Um, or you hear again, like you said, well, I was spanked and I don't see anything wrong with it. It's it's interesting. We live in a time when we acknowledge that so much has changed, science and technology and medical knowledge, and yet most of us, I think this is probably a pretty natural human thing, are stuck back when we went to school or when we were children. And it's certainly natural to default to what you knew, but I think it's also really important to understand that maybe you turned out okay, but maybe it was kind of lucky you did, or
Yeah.
maybe you're carrying things you don't fully realize because you were. I mean, who knows? Like,
Hmm.
but the fact that it was okay for you doesn't mean it is currently the very best idea. We have a lot of things we know now that are just things have changed. We've learned a lot.
Right. Right. And that's what I always like hope when I put a piece out into the world. I just hope that the readers who read it can think about, okay, well, I just need to look at this and think about this. Like, just because I wasn't raised this way doesn't mean that this is wrong. And so, yeah, I think parenting is something we need to think about and change things. And just because we were raised a certain way doesn't mean that that's the only way. So, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. My great grandmother apparently used to say that just she said she was a farm girl, so she used kind of a farm analogy, but she said each generation improves the stock. And her point was that she parented the best she knew how, and then her daughter got married and parented the best she knew how, but it was better. She had
right,
learned some things, and then my dad got married and parented the best he knew how, and he improved a lot along the way as well. And now I'd like to think I've hopefully improved. I know that watching my children parent, though, they have certainly improved, and really up the game, I think that's an important. So we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, and that can be a
right,
huge gift, but that doesn't mean we have to just stay there forever.
right, right. No, it's so true. And, I hear my own, yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I remember when I was a relatively new mom and my mother was visiting, and she was lying on the floor with my kids were, young at the time. And she said, gosh, I wish I had not spent so much time worrying about, ironing the pillowcases. I wish I had spent more time on the floor like you do with your kids. And she was wrong. She spent a lot of time with us and I'm grateful for it. But it's just interesting when I do think about, like, okay, when and if my kids have kids, what am I going to say to them, and along those same lines. So
Have you that just maybe this is too personal, and I'll cut it out, and I don't want to be intrusive, but I feel like one of the challenges of parenting is learning how to be a parent. It also sometimes puts you in a place where you have to really you you confront maybe some of the mistakes your parents made, and even if you know they were acting in good faith, all of us make mistakes, including our parents. If we're lucky, I feel like working through that process helps us actually appreciate them more. And we come eventually to empathize with them and understand this is a tough job, and they did the best they could. But has doing this parenting, editing and writing gig, has that had any impact on how you have, not only how you've seen your own parenting, but has that had I don't know, has that made the way you process your parents' parenting? Um, I'm kind of muddling that statement, but
no, I
does that
see
make
what
sense?
you're saying. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's funny, like I do feel very separate from how my parents parented. Like I look at them and say, well, they were of a different generation, and our family was about as traditional as it came. Like dad went to the office every day, mom was an art teacher and was home a lot, and was home over the summers. And so they fell along these very traditional roles where, yeah, my dad would come home in the evening and sit down and, have a drink and read the newspaper while mom made dinner. And so I look at that, and, and mom was like the default caregiver. Like, I can't imagine ever when I was sick going to my dad, who I'm very close with, but
Right.
he wasn't in
Right.
that role. And so that is definitely different from how Stephen and I do it now. And I do think about that, I guess, now that I'm talking about it, pretty frequently. I mean, my dad was the jokester and like would take us on the walks in the woods. And then my mom was the one who would do our projects with us and make sure we were feeling okay, and, take care of the house. And
Yeah,
yeah,
that's interesting. One of you mentioned this earlier, but one of the most wonderful changes I think are developments, let's say evolutions in parenting is how involved dads are.
yeah,
Um, I mean, I think I'm more involved than my dad was, and I know he was more. I mean, so I don't mean to throw, cast shade at anyone or be critical, but I love watching my sons parent. They are really good parents. And I also, though, my sense, and I get this sometimes it's because they tell me, but other times just watching, I also think it's very meaningful and fulfilling for them. And so it's really a win-win-win, I think, because I believe they're much more supportive,
Mm.
spouses, I think that their children are getting a gift, but I think they're getting a big gift too.
Mm.
And I love seeing that I hope this continues to, there's still some ways to go, obviously, but it seems to be a really healthy, wonderful trend for everyone.
I love that. You're so lucky. Yes, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, Amy, thank you so much for your time. As always, it's just wonderful to talk with you.
You
I
too.
appreciate all the good work you do out there, on for so many people on so many levels. Listeners, again, I just encourage you to check out On Parenting. It is the Washington Post's parenting section. Is it officially called a section or a blog, or what is the official
Section, I
terminology?
think is, yeah.
Section. Okay. Check Amy's work out. Sign up though for the newsletter, and that way you get to see Amy's kind of introduction and contextualizing of some of the pieces that come out, and she shares a lot of insights in those as well. So it's a wonderful resource. So Amy, thank you again for coming on today.
Thank you. This was so much fun. I'm always happy to talk parenting. It's all I think about.
That's all you do. Yeah. All right. Well, thank
I
you.
do have hobbies, I promise.
Well, that's good. You need some, or you'd I think that'd be hard to hold all day long. So, listeners, thank you again for joining in. This has been the Parent Teacher Conference podcast. I'm your host, Braden Bell. And again, I'll just ask you, if you don't mind, to take a moment and give us a rating. I'd love a glowing rating, if you can do that on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform that you access your podcasts. And this is the first time we've done kind of the fortnightly interval. Let me know how that's going for you. If you love it, if you like the old weekly one, whatever. Most of all, happy parenting. You've got this.